Welcome to Smart Bites. On this deep dive, we're looking into something that's, well, it's on a lot of people's minds. Cannabis use among teenagers. We've pulled together insights from some really solid sources. Think the World Health Organization, the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addiction, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and the Office of Addiction Services and Supports to really try and get a clear handle on this. So the big question we're tackling today is, what do parents and teens really need to understand about cannabis use during adolescence? And, what actually works for prevention and treatment? All right, let's dig in.
Yeah, it's crucial to start by saying, substance use in general isn't just a personal issue. It's a major global public health concern. It impacts health, safety, socioeconomic development, and it particularly hits children, young people, and families hard.
Right, it has ripples outwards.
Exactly. And the UN General Assembly has specifically highlighted the need for, evidence-based prevention. We need strategies that we know actually work.
And do we have those? Have we figured out what works?
Well, prevention science has come a long way, thankfully. We've learned a lot, and there are now international standards for prevention. Think of substance use prevention as a key part of a public health approach, and it's relevant across all age groups, not just teens. It's even baked into the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Strengthening prevention and treatment of substance abuse is right there.
Okay, so it's recognized as a global priority. Let's narrow down to cannabis specifically. We hear all sorts of names: marijuana, pot, kush, weed. It's been around forever, it feels like. But it's not simple, is it? It contains hundreds of chemicals, THC being the most well-known.
That's right. And the ways people consume it today are quite varied. It's definitely evolved.
How so? What are we seeing?
Well, you've got edibles, gummies, chocolates, baked goods. Then there are tinctures, those little dropper bottles, capsules or tablets too, even lozenges or films that dissolve in your mouth. Those are all ways it's absorbed.
Okay. And for inhaling?
Still pre-rolls, of course, but also concentrates are huge now. Things like dabs, shatter, wax. These are highly potent extracts. Then you have pipes, bongs, and vaping devices, which often use these concentrated oils.
The key thing I keep hearing, though, is the potency. It's not the same stuff people might have encountered decades ago.
Absolutely not. That's a critical point. The concentration of THC in many cannabis products today is significantly higher than it used to be.
And higher THC means stronger effects.
Exactly. Stronger effects on the brain, on behavior. It really changes the game, especially when we talk about adolescence.
Why is adolescence such a key time for this?
Because it's a unique developmental window.
Yeah.
It's often when substance use starts, but it's also a prime time for developing a substance use disorder and addiction. See, during the teen years, the brain systems driving emotions and seeking rewards are, they're fully online and quite active. But the parts responsible for judgment, planning, and self-control, the prefrontal cortex, are still under construction, still maturing.
So, like, the gas pedal is fully down, but the brakes aren't fully developed yet?
That's a great analogy. It leads to more impulsivity, more risk-taking behavior, which can include trying substances.
And you're saying their brains are more vulnerable then?
Yes, very much so. Teen brains are particularly susceptible to lasting changes from substance use. This neurobiological vulnerability increases the likelihood of developing addiction compared to starting use as an adult.
Wow.
And we also see that big life transitions starting high school, for example, can be periods of heightened risk. Plus, community factors matter. Peer influence is huge, and the perception that substance use is common or tolerated can definitely push a teen towards trying it.
Which brings us to legalization. Cannabis is legal for adults in many places now. That must send some confusing signals to kids, right?
Oh, absolutely. It creates a really complex environment for teens. They're getting mixed messages all over the place.
Like what?
Well, they might hear about medical uses, which can sound positive, but then also hear warnings about harm to their developing brains. They see celebrities endorsing or using it.
Which makes it seem normal or even cool.
Right. It makes it incredibly difficult for a teenager to accurately weigh the risks of using it themselves, especially when it's illegal for them but legal for adults next door. And data does show that prevalence tends to be higher in places post-legalization. There seems to be a correlation.
And does legalization make it seem safer? Does it normalize it?
That's a major concern. Normalization due to legalization can inadvertently send the message that it's less risky than it is, particularly for young people. We're actually seeing a decline in the perception of marijuana's harmfulness among teenagers.
What do you think that is?
Part of it might be this idea that it's natural, therefore it must be safe. But that completely ignores the dramatically increased potency we just talked about.
So lower perceived risk, but higher actual potency.
Exactly. It's a dangerous mismatch. Those higher THC concentrations mean potentially more intense psychoactive effects, faster development of tolerance, and a greater risk for negative consequences.
And I guess just plain availability plays a role too, if it's easier to get.
Definitely. Ease of access is a factor. Increased availability in legalized areas has, in some unfortunate cases, been linked to other issues too, like more young children accidentally being exposed.
Or unintended consequences.
And we can't underestimate peer influence. Friends are a huge factor in whether a teen starts using marijuana and whether they continue. Peer pressure is still very real.
Okay, so it's more potent, more available, perceived as less risky, and peers play a big role. Let's get into science. What does THC actually do to a developing brain?
Okay, so THC, the main psychoactive compound, works by binding to specific sites in the brain called cannabinoid receptors. These receptors are part of a natural system called the endocannabinoid system. Think of it as the body's own cannabis-like system that helps regulate critical functions.
Likewise.
Things like brain development itself, mood, appetite, learning, memory, stress response. It's involved in a lot. And these cannabinoid receptors are packed into certain brain areas.
Which areas?
Key spots include regions involved in pleasure and reward, memory formation like the hippocampus, higher level thinking in the prefrontal cortex, concentration, perception of time, and also areas controlling movement and coordination like the cerebellum and basal ganglia.
So THC comes in and basically disrupts this natural system.
Precisely. It floods the system and overstimulates these receptors much more intensely and for longer than the body's natural endocannabinoids would. This disrupts normal brain communication.
And that causes the high.
Yes, and the other immediate effects. But repeated overstimulation forces the brain to adapt. It might reduce the number of receptors or their sensitivity. This leads to tolerance needing more drug for the same effect and withdrawal symptoms when use stops. This whole cycle can pave the way for addiction.
And you said the teen brain is especially sensitive.
Extremely, because it's still actively developing, wiring itself up, pruning connections. Introducing a powerful substance like THC during this critical construction phase can have profound and potentially lasting impacts.
Let's talk about that prefrontal cortex again, the decision-making part.
Right, the CEO of the brain, responsible for executive functions like planning, judgment, impulse control. It doesn't fully mature until the mid-20s. THC exposure during adolescence can interfere with this maturation process, potentially leading to long-term difficulties with those executive functions.
And memory, the hippocampus.
Yes, the hippocampus is crucial for learning and memory, and it's dense with cannabinoid receptors. THC impairs its ability to process information properly. Animal studies show that adolescent THC exposure can lead to persistent problems with learning and memory tasks later in life. Some human studies suggest heavy use might even affect its size.
That's worrying. What about coordination and reaction time?
THC affects the cerebellum and basal ganglia, which control balance, posture, coordination, and reaction time. This is why driving under the influence is so dangerous and why it can impact things like sports performance.
And does it affect how the brain is wired, the connections?
There's evidence suggesting marijuana use in adolescents might alter brain structure, potentially reducing the volume or integrity of neural fibers in areas important for alertness, learning, and memory. The brain's communication pathways might be affected.
So we're talking about potentially lasting cognitive effects. What kind of problems might linger?
Research points towards persistent deficits, even after stopping use, in areas like memory, attention, learning speed, information processing, problem solving, and those executive functions we discussed.
Is it true about the potential IQ drop?
Some longitudinal studies have suggested a link between heavy, persistent adolescent cannabis use starting young and a decline in IQ points, potentially up to 8 points in some cases, that may not be fully recoverable even with abstinence later on.
Wow, an 8-point drop is significant.
It is, and these difficulties with learning, memory, attention, concentration, problem solving, they can really impact school performance, future job prospects, and just general functioning.
Okay, those are the cognitive risks. What about physical health? Is smoking marijuana harmful like smoking tobacco?
Marijuana smoke contains many of the same toxins and carcinogens as tobacco smoke. Regular smoking can lead to chronic cough, increased phlegm production, bronchitis, and potentially raise the risk of lung infections and other respiratory illnesses.
And for teen athletes?
It can definitely impair performance. It affects timing, motor control, coordination, reaction time, all crucial for sports.
What about pregnancy? If a teenager using cannabis gets pregnant?
That carries significant risks. Cannabis use during pregnancy is linked to fetal growth restriction, premature birth, stillbirth, and potential long-term consequences for the baby's brain development and behavior. And THC passes into breast milk.
Are there other physical effects people should know about?
Yes, there's cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS, severe cycles of nausea and vomiting in some chronic users. There's also some research exploring potential links to an aggressive form of testicular cancer, possible negative impacts on the immune system, effects on fertility hormones, and the immediate effect of increasing heart rate after use, which could be risky for some.
That's a lot on the physical side. What about mental health impacts?
This is another area of major concern. Adolescent marijuana use is consistently linked with an increased risk for developing depression, social anxiety, and having suicidal thoughts or attempts.
And psychosis.
Yes, there's an increased risk of experiencing temporary psychotic episodes, hallucinations, delusions, paranoia, especially with high-potency products. More seriously, there's a significant association between early, frequent cannabis use and the later development of persistent psychotic disorders, most notably schizophrenia.
Especially in vulnerable individuals.
Exactly, particularly in those with a personal or family history of psychosis. It can also worsen symptoms in adolescents who already have schizophrenia.
What about motivation? I've heard the term amotivational syndrome.
Yes, while it's debated as a formal diagnosis, a pattern of reduced motivation, apathy, and diminished interest in usual activities is often observed in regular adolescent users. It seems linked to THC's effects on reward pathways.
And emotional regulation.
THC affects brain regions like the amygdala and prefrontal cortex that are critical for processing and managing emotions. This can lead to impaired emotional regulation in adolescents. All these impacts, cognitive, motivational, emotional, contribute to negative psychosocial outcomes. We see links to school failure, lower grades, higher dropout rates,
And relationships.
impaired peer relationships, difficulties in social situations, failure to meet responsibilities at school or home, giving up activities they once valued. It's also associated with other risky behaviors like unprotected sex or driving under the influence. Long-term, users often report lower life satisfaction and more relationship problems.
It's clear the potential downsides are significant. When does use cross the line into what we call addiction?
That's a key distinction. Addiction, or clinically what we call a substance use disorder, SUD, is defined as a chronic relapsing brain disorder. It's characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite harmful consequences. It involves long-lasting changes in the brain.
How is it diagnosed?
Using criteria like those in the DSM-5, doctors look for a pattern of symptoms indicating impaired control over use, social impairment, risky use, and pharmacological indicators like tolerance or withdrawal.
And can marijuana use lead to this?
Absolutely. Repeated marijuana use can lead to marijuana use disorder. The risk of developing addiction is estimated to be higher for those who start using in their teens, perhaps around 1 in 6, compared to about 1 in 10 for those who start as adults.
So starting young really increases the risk.
It does, and distinguishing between use, misuse, and a disorder is important. But given the potential harms, any use in adolescence is risky.
Which underscores the need for early intervention if use starts.
Definitely. Early identification and intervention are critical due to the serious health risks and the high likelihood of co-occurring mental health problems.
But are teens getting the help they need?
Unfortunately, no. There's a significant treatment gap. Only a small fraction of adolescents who could benefit from treatment for substance use actually receive it. Lack of awareness, denial, stigma, lack of accessible services, they all play a role.
That's a problem. So what can we do on the prevention side? What actually works?
Effective prevention isn't just one thing, it's multi-layered. It involves families, schools, communities, and policy working together.
When should prevention efforts start?
Early. Conversations about substance use should ideally begin in late elementary or middle school before exposure becomes more likely. And we need to use evidence-based programs interventions that have been scientifically evaluated and shown to be effective. The UN, ODC, and WHO strongly recommend this approach, targeting families, schools, and communities.
What's the role of parents in prevention? It sounds crucial.
Hugely crucial. Open communication is key, talking honestly about the risks. Clear parental disapproval of underage use is a strong protective factor. Also, parents modeling healthy coping behaviors themselves, teaching kids refusal skills, providing consistent support and monitoring, and fostering strong family bonds, all of these make a big difference.
And in schools and the community.
Comprehensive drug education that goes beyond just scare tactics, teaching life skills like decision-making and stress management. Creating supportive school climates where students feel connected. Community initiatives can aim to reduce access, change social norms around underage use, and provide positive alternative activities for young people.
And policy. You mentioned legalization's impact.
Yes, public policy needs to consider adolescent health. This includes regulations around marketing, product labeling, especially for high-potency items, and public education campaigns to counter declining risk perceptions.
Okay, that's prevention. What if a teen is already using cannabis? Is there a role for harm reduction?
This needs to be approached very cautiously with adolescents. The primary goal should always be cessation stopping use because any use poses risks to their development. However, while working towards that goal, harm reduction strategies might focus on minimizing acute risks.
Such as?
Discussing the dangers of using high-potency products versus lower THC options, though verifying potency can be hard. Strongly advising against mixing cannabis with alcohol or other drugs. Emphasizing the absolute danger of driving or operating machinery while impaired. Also, raising awareness about the risk of contaminated supplies, like cannabis laced with fentanyl, which is incredibly dangerous.
What about moderation?
Some sources might mention moderation strategies, but for adolescents, given the illegality and developmental risks, this is highly problematic. Any harm reduction conversation must be framed within the ultimate goal of achieving abstinence. A practical harm reduction step families can take is having a no questions asked policy for a safe ride home if their teen finds themselves in a risky situation involving substances.
That makes sense. If prevention and harm reduction aren't enough, and a teen needs formal treatment for marijuana use disorder, what are the evidence-based options?
Psychosocial interventions, basically. Therapies are the mainstays of treatment for adolescents.
Like CBT.
Yes, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, is very well supported. It helps teens identify triggers, challenge unhelpful thoughts, learn coping skills to manage cravings, improve decision-making, and prevent relapse. It's usually weekly sessions for several months.
What else?
Motivational interviewing, MI, or a brief version called Motivational Enhancement Therapy, MMET, are effective, especially early on. They help resolve ambivalence and build the teen's own motivation to change. And given the context of adolescence, family-based therapies are often highly effective.
Why family therapy?
Because adolescent substance use rarely happens in a vacuum. It's often intertwined with family dynamics, communication patterns, parental supervision. Therapies like brief strategic family therapy, BSFT, functional family therapy, FFT, multidimensional family therapy, MDFT, or multisystemic therapy, MST, address the whole family system.
Are there medications?
Currently, there are no FDA-approved medications specifically for adolescent marijuana addiction. However, some research is looking into medications like N-acetylcysteine, or NAC, which shows some early promise, particularly for reducing cravings, usually used alongside behavioral therapies.
It really sounds like parents and families are central throughout this whole process.
Absolutely pivotal. From prevention to recognizing a problem, seeking help, participating in treatment, and providing long-term recovery support, family involvement is critical.
So what helps families do that?
Again, open communication, setting clear boundaries and expectations with consistent consequences, but always balanced with unwavering love and support. There are also evidence-based family skills training programs, like the Strengthening Families program or Triple P, which UNODC recommends. These programs teach practical skills to improve communication, strengthen bonds, and manage conflict, reducing risk factors.
And resources for families struggling with this.
Yep. Yes, thankfully there are many. Organizations like SAMHS, NIDA, Partnership to End Addiction provide reliable information and helplines. Peer support groups like Narnon, Marnon, or Smart Recovery Family and Friends offer invaluable connection and shared experience. Online parent coaching programs are also emerging.
That's good to know support is out there. Are there ethical considerations specific to treating adolescents for substance use?
Yes, absolutely. Guidelines from WHO, UNODC, and professional bodies emphasize that treatment must be developmentally appropriate, evidence-based, and respect the adolescent's rights. Key principles include ensuring services are available and accessible, maintaining ethical standards around informed consent or assent from the teen and consent from parents' guardians, strict confidentiality within legal limits, using treatments proven effective for this age group, and strongly favoring family-oriented approaches.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, it seems the key takeaway is that cannabis use during adolescence is definitely not harmless. It carries real risks for the developing brain, for mental and physical health, and long-term outcomes.
That's right. It's not a benign substance for this age group.
An early prevention involving families and communities is really vital. But if use does become a problem, there are effective, evidence-based treatments available, and family support is key to success.
Exactly. Open communication, education based on facts, not fear or normalization, and seeking professional help when needed are crucial steps.
This has been incredibly informative. Thanks for breaking down such a complex topic.
My pleasure. It's an important conversation to have.
Definitely. So here's something to think about as we finish. Considering the changing legal landscape of cannabis around the world, how can we as communities best strike that balance between adult freedoms and the undeniable need to protect vulnerable adolescents from potential harm? Something to ponder. This has been Smart Bites. Thanks for tuning in.